Now?
Hello, and welcome to Books on Tap Live from Publishers Weekly. I'm Emma Cantor, Deputy Children's Book Editor at PW. Today I'm speaking with author June Hur about her new YA novel, The Forest of Stolen Girls. The book is out April 20th from Macmillan Children's Publishing Group, which is sponsoring this event. Hello, June. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here.
Absolutely. Before we get started, I have a few announcements for everyone tuning in at home. We're giving away a digital galley or multiple digital galleys of the book ahead of its publication. You can enter for a chance to win one of those by going to publishersweekly.com/her, H-U-R, and we are also dropping that link in the Facebook and YouTube comments sections. During the event, you, our audience, are welcome to submit your own questions for June by writing them again in the comment section of Facebook or YouTube, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible towards the end of the event. Finally, if you'd like to receive notifications of future events in the series, sign up at publishersweekly.com/booksontap-live. And now onto the show. So where are you joining us from, June?
From Toronto, Canada.
And what was the genesis of this historical mystery set in Korea?
So I was researching for my debut when I came across a letter that I knew wasn't applicable to the debut I was working on. But it was a letter written by a government official in 1300s Korea. And he was writing to the king, basically begging the king to do something about this very tragic historical event that was going on, where the Korean government was basically sending young women to China as tribute. So it was basically an ancient trafficking kind of government organized trafficking going on, and I was, heartbroken by it, but also very curious as to, why girls were being sent over to another country in the first place. And so I looked into it, and I decided that in the future, well, it became this book, but I wanted to write a book revolving around this historical event. And so, yeah, that was the genesis.
And at the heart of the novel, you have these two sisters who on the surface seem like opposites. One is in training to become a shaman and is very spiritual, and the other is following in her father's footsteps and investigating this crime. So she's playing detective. In what ways do you see the sisters, though, actually engaging in mysteries in a similar way or learning from each other?
So the older sister is the more almost level-headed, logical kind of character, where she refuses to believe that anything bad has happened to her father until she's found evidence. And so far, the police in the story haven't really found solid evidence. They're just kind of going on a hunch. The father's been missing for a year, so they're just assuming he's dead. But finally refuses to believe that until she's found solid evidence. And so that's how she kind of focused on the investigation, whereas her younger estranged sister, is the more emotions-based, and she kind of has an assumption, and she'll end up looking for evidence that kind of supports her assumption. And so in that way, they kind of conflict because they go about investigating in a very different way. But in the end, they learn from each other in the sense that they realize that no matter how different they go about investigating and searching for the truth, they realize that, both of them have good intentions. Both of them want the best for each other. They want to bring family together. And so even though they might not agree with each other, they realize that they really need to just learn to rely on each other and work with each other and the differences involved.
Taking a broader historical look, the roles available to women at that time that you set the story, they were very limited. I'm curious, in what ways do you see your two characters, the Min sisters, struggling under those restrictions and pushing back in a way?
So the struggle is most felt by the oldest sister because she's coming from the mainland Korea, where it's very deeply rooted in Confucianism. And Confucianism has a very strict hierarchy where it's like, almost has a Victorian vibe where it's like, women belong in the household, men belong in the public sphere. And when women go outside, they need to cover their face with veils. And women are basically expected to marry and, birth children. But then, when the father goes missing, Hwan Yi is forced to basically push against these boundaries that are forcing her to stay at home and to think of and to consider a future where future involves marriage and children. But she wants to look for her father. And the last place her father was seen is on Jeju Island. And Jeju Island back then was a penal island, so criminals would be sent there on exile. And so she ends up kind of disguising herself, leaving the domestic sphere and searching for her father in Jeju Island. And that's where her estranged younger sister is. And so her younger sister so even on Jeju, there are very, set kind of structures for women, but it's much looser compared to the mainland based on my research. And you can really tell how different the structure is, where in Jeju, it's almost like a more matriarchal kind of island where a lot of the economy is based on Hanja fish divers. So they were women who would dive into the sea and collect, and create, basically make a living off of fish sea diving. And so women were much more independent there. And so that's kind of like the difference in structure that existed in Jeju. So her sister dealt with it a bit less. It was still there, but not so much.
Yes, you include a scene of the deep sea divers that really stood out. That was a great moment. And in addition to these limited roles for women, your book touches on violence against them. You mentioned the human trafficking. And I am wondering if you have any thoughts on why this violence against the female body is such a central part of mysteries and thrillers.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I absolutely love history, and based on the history that I've come to learn about, whether it's Victorian England history or Korean history, there is a deeply rooted patriarchy involved there. And I think when it comes to very toxic patriarchy, you see a lot of women as the victim, where women are victimized, and yet you don't really see the police as involved, especially when it comes to lower class women. And so that's something I noticed in Korean history. And it's something we continue to see even nowadays, where when it comes to marginalized women, you don't see, like headlines on the newspaper as often. And I think, as a woman myself, it's that kind of violence that stands out to me the most, because I'm a woman. And when I go outside, it's like it's on my mind, like, oh my gosh, it's nighttime, like what if something happens to me? And as a mom of a daughter, I'm extra conscious of no matter how strong women can be, there are like structures in place that kind of put women on, that can make women a bit more unsafe. And so with the reality that I often see on the news and so on, I think as an author, the reason why I write is to take the things that frustrate me and anger me in the world and wanting to fix it and create a sense of order and justice in my book. And so I think that's why I can't speak for other writers, but for myself, because I see so much violence against women in history, especially as a writer of historicals, I want to kind of unravel it within my fiction and kind of bring closure to the cases that I saw in history not being resolved. So it's just me basically being frustrated and aware of what's going on, but wanting to bring closure.
That's also interesting. And I feel like your intent certainly comes across in that the descriptions of violence, they aren't sensationalized in any way in this book, as they can be in certain sort of pulpy
Yeah.
thrillers that we see in America, at least.
And just to add, I think it's also important that because women are victims in my book, it's also important to have women as the detectives who solve the problem, and not just like male saviors all the time, you know.
That's a great point. Speaking though about the family patriarch, I found Inspector Min's character very interesting. He is, of course, an absence at the center of the book. He is missing throughout it, but he feels very present, at least to his daughters and to the people they interact with, because they have been questioned by him as well about the same cases. How did you go about developing his character?
It's probably a bit of it is from experience, because I grew up like half my life without my parents. They live in Korea and we have a great relationship. But I came to Canada to study, and I set roots here. And so I've grown up most of half of my life without my parents. And yet I've learned through experience that, you know, even though they're not right beside me, they're very present. And I think it just kind of naturally came out in my writing, where even though the father's not there, he's still there in their memories, alive in their memories. And another thing is, I think the father, Detective Min, was the easiest to write, because I think I grew up with my parents were very loving, and yet, you know, they're human. And so as I grow older, I realize that parents can be super loving and yet they're still flawed. And as a new parent myself, I see that kind of tension where I love my daughter so much, but I make mistakes, and that's what I really wanted to portray in the book, where sometimes parents wish the best for you, and yet sometimes it doesn't come out the way that maybe they wanted to with that good intent. And so I feel like that's why he feels very three-dimensional, even though he's not present in the book.
Definitely. The so-called golden age of detective fiction feels so Eurocentric. I can't think of a Korean detective who looms as large in the public eye as, say, Sherlock Holmes or
Yeah.
Hercule Poirot, for example. Can you talk about writing an own voices mystery and any other traditions you're pulling from there?
So when the reason why I began writing Korean historical mysteries is for that exact reason. Like, I grew up really enjoying Victorian mysteries, and in Victorian mysteries, like a lot of mysteries involve just an escapist from, you know, our reality. And it's not really the history that's involved in these kind of escapist mysteries. It's not really like talking about the struggle, like about trauma. Whereas a lot of the Korean fiction that I read, and I think they're very important to discuss the struggle, but a lot of them are about, you know, the immigration struggle, the struggle of colonization. And I love those books. And yet I wanted to read a book that involved something other than like the trauma within a country that's sometimes too close to home for me. This trauma is something that, you know, even my grandparents' generation still struggle with. So sometimes I want to distance myself from it. but I don't find too many Korean historicals that talk about Korean history apart from that very recent trauma. And so I ended up trying to look for a book, just like a Korean historical that would offer that escapist element, but I couldn't find too many. Like, there are those books out there, but there aren't too many. And so I was like, like I would absolutely love to read a book set in Korea that almost follows the tradition of, the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, but it's set in a non-Western country. And so I couldn't find it, so I was just like, maybe I should write this book myself. And I've been writing other books before, but they were never set in Korea. And so for the first time, I dove into research, and as I was researching, it was one of the most amazing feelings ever, because I felt like I was even coming to learn more about myself, as I researched about Korea. And so what happened was, while writing an own voice Korean historical, I found that the history itself became a mystery to me. So as I was trying to untangle the history to get to know it better, I would kind of wrap a police procedural mystery around it. And that's how the experience was. And it was one of the most difficult experience, because I don't know Korean too well enough to research with ease. And yet it was one of the most rewarding experiences as well.
And both of your novels, Silence of Bones and now The Forest of Stolen Girls, are set specifically in, it's around the 15th century of Korea, is that right?
So it's set in Chosun, Korea, and Chosun, Korea is one of the longest dynasties in Korea. I believe it started, I could be wrong, but around 14th, 15th century, and it ended near the late 1800s. Yeah.
And what draws you to that epic?
So the first one is the fashion. I absolutely love the fashion of the Chosun period, and the Chosun period is also one of the most popular periods that Korean historical dramas are set in. And so that's my main reason. I grew up with a lot of Korean dramas, really famous ones like Jewel in the Palace and Dongi, that are set in the Chosun period. So it's always been like my favorite period. And on the practical side, the Chosun period also has the most resources that I can tap into when I'm researching. I find that the further back you go in Korean history, it's a bit harder to find like English resources. And I find that I have to dip more into Korean resources, and they're the most reliable, actually, the Korean ones, but it's just very time consuming. So yeah, that's my reason.
I see in your bio that you were born in South Korea and grew up mainly in Canada. Did you end up going back for on-the-ground research and inspiration?
Yes. So I lived in Canada most of my life. I went to Korea for high school, and then that's where we decided that my parents would end up living in Korea, and then I came back to Canada. So I go every year or two to visit my parents. And while I was working on The Forest of Stolen Girls, because the research involved Jeju, and Jeju I find is a very marginalized history, because back then it was a penal island, and my dad grew up in Jeju, and even he was like, yeah, he doesn't know too much about Jeju history. So what I did was, I researched as much as I could in Canada, but then I found that there weren't as many resources, and I wasn't too comfortable with the gaps in my research. So when I was in Korea to visit my parents last year, my husband and I, we just checked the flights to Jeju, and we're like, oh, it's actually really affordable and it's nearby. So we booked tickets and we went there, and it was amazing because so much of the resource I couldn't find, I found there in outdoor museums. So they had traditional villages, traditional village museums set up, and I got to like see how the huts and houses were made, and I got to know the history better, and so that really helped me.
How interesting. And have you had the chance to share the book in any stage with your family?
I shared it with my sister because the book is kind of based on my relationship with her,
Hmm.
and she gave me the green light of approval, and I was like, phew. My parents want to wait for the final copy, and my husband is still on the first few chapters of my first book, so it's taking a while to get to the second one.
Uh, that's great. And did you find it challenging to start on this second book, especially given the success of your debut?
So it wasn't challenging as I thought it would be. It was so I thought it would be challenging because I hear stories about how authors, once they write their debut, there's suddenly this feeling that readers are watching you. But I didn't struggle with that so much, maybe because I wrote for myself for so long, and so I was able to kind of um, write for myself again with the second book. The hard part was the deadline. I've never written on a deadline before. And so writing on a deadline and not knowing whether or not this story idea was good enough or would hold a candle up to The Silence of Bones, that was really challenging. But I realized I just had to have faith in my writing process. So yeah, it was one of the most difficult books I've ever had to write. And it was mainly because I'm so used to just writing a bit and then switching to another idea and then trying out different ideas. But I couldn't do it under a deadline. So I just had to stick to one idea. And that was super nerve wracking and challenging. But I'm glad it turned out okay in the end.
You also mention in your acknowledgments for the book that you drafted it while pregnant, revised while caring for your newborn, and were also reworking during the pandemic,
Yeah.
which is just incredible to me. How did you juggle all of this? How did you keep your sense of purpose?
What helped me the most was, so in the beginning I was very scared because being an author was my dream. I just didn't know that it would coincide with when I got pregnant. But then I reached out on social media to other writers, and I was just like, is it even possible to follow your dream when you're a mom? And there was just like an outpouring of support, an outpouring of stories. And I realized that, when no matter how little time we might have, we end up getting the job done. And so what I found was that I actually ended up getting more done when I was going through this than when I was like childless, because when I was childless, like I'd sit in front of the computer for the whole day and I'd be like, like I don't know what to do. And I'd walk off, I'd come back on Twitter. But then when I realized I had so little time, I ended up just basically like thinking of the book the whole day while I was taking care of my daughter. And obviously my husband helped a lot as well. And then at night when she would go to sleep, I would write, and I'd write only for like 2 hours, and yet like there was no writer's block involved because I had no time for that. And so I think being able to just let the story simmer throughout the day for hours, and then sitting down, knowing the words that I needed to get done, that really helped me. And another technique that really helped me was while my daughter napped, or while she was just kind of like, well, when she fell asleep on my lap, I just have a notebook and I jot down ideas. And once night, when she went back to sleep at night, then I would take all my notes and write the story out, and it worked out in the end. I'm surprised, but it worked out.
That's really amazing. And I imagine for authors at home. That's so encouraging to hear too, how everything brought sort of focus and clarity to the time you did have. Um, the mystery and suspense going back to this new book, it's so well paced and well executed. Are you someone who needs to outline before you start writing?
Thank you so much for saying that. I was so like, I think because it's my second novel, like I was like, I've always, it's like like I had no idea whether I did well or not, but seeing feedback from other readers, it's been very reassuring. What I usually do when I write mystery is I always make sure that the mystery is outlined in as much detail as possible. And then I kind of pants the character development. So I have the mystery structure, and then every chapter, I'm not quite sure what the characters will do to find this evidence that I want them to find in, like, for example, chapter 2. And so they pants around the mystery that I've already outlined.
And what role did your editor play in helping to shape The Forest of Stolen Girls?
She played a huge role. I'm so grateful to her because, like I kind of mentioned, this second book was so hard to write, and I was so insecure about it. While I was I rewrote it a few times because it just didn't click for me. And I was already Googling, like, how do you live with the burden of publishing a book you don't like? And I was just so scared that it wasn't like good enough. But then when I sent my draft to my editor, she emailed me back, and after reading it, she was just like, I might actually like this book more than your debut. And I was like, what? Because I spent 2 years on my debut, and the fact that she still enjoyed my second book, that was such a huge like burst of motivation for me. And so that really gave me the strength to tackle my next huge revision that I had to do with her. And yeah, that she just that one comment made the biggest difference for me. And I don't know where this book would be without her.
You mentioned that you were a big reader of mysteries growing up. Were you a writer too?
I was. Well, I began writing a bit later in life, if 12 years old is considered later in life.
I don't know about that.
I fell in love with Pride and Prejudice when I was 12 because I wasn't much of a reader when I was younger than 12. And so my dad would try to buy as many different books as possible for me. And I just got hooked on Pride and Prejudice. And that's when I began writing Pride and Prejudice fan fiction. And fan fiction was what really solidified my love for writing. And so, yeah, I began at 12 and kept writing since then.
Wonderful. And did you always know you wanted to write for a teen audience?
Not quite. I didn't realize it until, so when I was on querying to agents, and then I landed representation with Amy Bishop at Distel, and she made a comment that really just like sunk into my mind. I never considered writing for teens until she read my book about a 16-year-old detective girl, which I thought was a coming of age story for the adult market. But she's just like, she read it and she was like, I wish I'd read this as a teen. And her words just like, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then when we began revising, she asked if I'd be open to switching over to the YA market. And, even though I never considered writing YA, I've, grown up reading it. And so I was open to it. And as I've continued writing for the YA market, I realized like the themes that a lot of YA books write about, it really resonates with me because I feel like I've never outgrown my teen struggles, like about identity and, the longing to belong, and searching for your home. So I absolutely love those topics, and I don't think I won't outgrow it for a very, very long time. Um, and and yeah, so now I realize, like, yeah, the teen writing for a teen audience is something that I never knew I'd love so much, but I do now, and I'm so grateful that I get to write for the young audience.
It's great how you found your niche
Mm-hmm.
that way. So, switching gears, we have a lot of great questions from your readers, and I'd like to take the time to pose them to you. We have one from Vicky Chen,
Mm-hmm.
who asks, was there anything in particular that was super interesting to research for The Forest of Stolen Girls? A fun tidbit, maybe, that made its way into the book?
Um, the fun. So what I really found fascinating about Jeju was, there are so Jeju is made of a lot of like hills, and I didn't know, but those hills are lava tubes. And so sometimes, like, there's stories of, random travelers who will just find a hole, and that hole will kind of like open up into this huge lava tube cave, and that kind of gets its way into the story without spoilers. It's a
Yes, no
yes.
spoilers. Oh,
So
very cool.
yeah, so that I found that so fascinating. And so I got to visit one when I was in Korea, and it's so mysterious and lovely.
I was going to ask, that's amazing. Another question about research from Andrew Sass. At what stage do you do that investigating? Is it all completed prior to drafting the novel, or do you research as you go along?
So I'm guessing it's like historical research.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So for me, I always begin with the history. I find that if I don't know the history and, the limitations of the world, because, when I'm writing about the historical past, there are limitations, of what characters can do, where characters can go. And so I try to do the like a foundational level of research, and that's when my characters can move and breathe. So I begin in the beginning, and I just make sure I know enough to feel like if I'm dropped into that period, that I won't be like completely lost.
A question about language from Glenn Held. Would the Korean language spoke back in the 1400s, would that be understandable to today's Korean speakers, do you
That's
think?
interesting. Based on Korean dramas, I think it's a bit more complicated, and I think they used a bit more like words that involved Hanja, which is classical Chinese characters. Not all the time, but like for I think the nobility, they must have used a bit more complicating terms that would require like a dictionary nowadays. But if if Korea's past is anything like Korean historicals, I think we would get the gist of it.
And did you find it difficult ever to set your story so back in the past? It's a question from Margie.
I I've always, since I began writing Pride and Prejudice, I've always wrote about the past. So when I wasn't writing about Korean history, I was writing about British history. Um, and I majored in history at university. And so I feel like because of my obsession for history, it's kind of given me the tools to tackle writing historicals. But I did find that the second book was particularly hard just because the resources wasn't as easy to access.
Hmm. And I suppose that's where imagination
Yeah.
comes in. Um, Rebecca Joy Mensinga asks, what was a favorite part of the book for you to write?
My favorite part was probably the confrontation scene between the heroines and the killer. It was a scene I was really working up towards throughout the whole story. So yeah, that was my favorite.
And Maeve Brewer would like to know, what is your process for character development, and how much of your own personality do you put in your characters, if any?
All the characters that I write involve a little part of me. So it might not be like me per se, but maybe thoughts I've had or struggles I've had. And so, for example, the heroine, it really kind of captures the struggles I've had as an older sister. Um, and usually the characters, I kind of put them through this question test where like I have this list of questions and I try to answer everything for them, and it could be as basic as color their eyes to, you know, what is their deepest darkest secrets. So yeah, that's what I do.
This is a fun question from Anne. Do you have a writing playlist?
Ooh, yes, I do. I always listen to music when I write, and I have a playlist set up on Spotify, and I guess I will share it on Twitter or something.
Oh, excellent. Can you give any hints about artists or songs that are go-tos?
My go-tos are soundtracks. So like soundtracks from music. I always have like scores from Interstellar or Korean dramas, intense music like that.
Oh, interesting. I'm someone, I can't really write with music, but I imagine any song without words
Yes,
is
exactly.
more
I can't
conducive
do
to
words.
that. Great. Rose Green has a compliment and a question. She says the Silence of Bones would make an excellent K-drama,
Aw.
and she wants to know, has there been any interest in dramatizing it?
There, I don't know if I'm. So there have been vague interest, but nothing, no movement so far. Nothing that I can speak of. Yeah.
Well, Rose is looking forward. If we can generate enough buzz, maybe. You mentioned K-dramas before. Cynthia Robbins would like to know, do you have any favorite Korean horror writers? I
Horror.
guess Page or Scream.
Horror?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Um, I don't, I'm like a wimp, so I'm not good with horror, but there are like mysteries that are borderline horrific. So for Korean TV shows, I would say Signal is fantastic Korean detective show that's also terrifying. And also
I'm making note of this.
yes, it's so good. It's amazing. And The Alienist on Netflix, it's horrific, but really well done. And on book, I would recommend any book by Tana French. She's an amazing mystery author.
And why did you choose the thriller mystery or genre to tell the story?
Mm, so that's a great question because I've always written romance all my life, and then something just switched off, and I just found the romance genre really difficult to write. And my dream has always been to write mysteries because I love mystery shows and books. I just didn't feel like smart enough to write it. But then one day when, querying wasn't working out for me, I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to write whatever I want to write. I don't care if it gets published or not. I'll just write it. And so I wrote a mystery, and I found that writing mysteries are such great lessons on how to build a solid plot. I didn't know how to plot before. I realized that's why agents rejected my other books, was I had no plot, but mysteries have a very solid plot structure involved. And the detective has to go from, A, B, C. They have to find these evidences in order to get to the conclusion. And so I find that I'm sticking to mystery now because I love that solid plot structure involved.
That's something I admire a lot about mysteries, that the plot, it's well crafted and it's twisty a lot of times, but a good one, I think, gives enough clues that the reader could maybe figure it out, or in retrospect, it makes sense at least.
I agree.
What was the most difficult part of writing the book? Anthony asked that.
Mm, the most difficult part was, again, the history. Especially because I'm writing about Jeju history, I was very aware that it's a very marginalized history and I didn't want to represent it in an incorrect way. And so I think that really like petrified me for a moment, where I just was stuck and I couldn't get myself to write. But in the end, I had a deadline to reach, and just reading as much literature as I could about that place and trying to, because I couldn't even close the gap with imagination because I didn't have the resources to let my imagination thrive in. So getting to actually visit Jeju really helped me get over that kind of, little ditch I was in.
Jamie Hayden would like to know, what do you feel is the most important skill for a writer to have?
Oof. I would say there are two skills. One would be perseverance, because I think not probably like 99% of writers aren't born with like natural talent. It's kind of grown from practice and learning to take rejections and learning to incorporate, critiques from others. And my other suggestion would be learning to have discipline. So knowing to discipline yourself in the sense that don't totally put life on hold. Like learn how to balance work and life. I think that's very important.
Just saw a question flash against the screen. What have been some of the challenges and triumphs of writing historical fiction about an Eastern country in a world flooded with Western literature? So we touched upon that a little bit.
Yeah, I think the first is the difficulty in accessing resources, and just like the uncertainty of whether there is an audience out there. But clearly there is. I loved finding out that there are readers out there. And the triumph, I would say, is being able to realize that history outside of the West is still as rich and beautiful and complex. And I think that's a great triumph. If any book about, non-Western countries can reveal that to readers, I think that's a triumph.
And Ashley Ayash asks, when you imagine your reader, who do you see?
When I imagine my reader, I imagine someone like me. I imagine someone who is kind of homesick, because I'm always a bit homesick because I don't live with my parents. I'm always wondering, what makes a person worthy. And I always realize it's never the things that we do. I think just by existing, we have dignity and worth. And that's something I always want to explore in my writing. And so I'm always imagining a reader who's also always searching for those questions.
Wonderful. And before we wrap up, I would like to know what's on tap next for you.
Right now, I'm working on my third book, The Red Palace, and that's about a 17-year-old nurse and a 18-year-old police inspector, and they have to work together to solve a massacre at court.
Ooh, intriguing. I'm also curious, is there any chance of another mystery for the Min sisters?
Not at the moment, but I always write my mystery novels with an open ending of possibility, because I see every book that I write as an origin story for a sleuth. So yeah.
Very nice. Well, this was fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And thanks to everyone watching at home. Once again, I've been speaking with author June Hur about her forthcoming YA novel, The Forest of Stolen Girls. We'll be taking a short holiday break, but we hope to see you here back in January when YA author Dana Davis kicks us off in the new year with her new romance novel, Roman and Jewel. That's on January 6th. Sign up to receive a reminder of the event at publishersweekly.com/booksontap live, and we'll see you then.